nervous system. And then there are peripheral ganglia that form the autonomic nervous system. And we'll get much more into detail about those two, the divisions of the peripheral nervous system later on. The sensory neurons collect information about the environment and they send it to the brain. And we call those sensory neurons afferent neurons. And then we have motor neurons that project to target organs and to muscles, and they control the muscular contractions needed to produce movement. We call those efferent nerves or neurons. And so if you always remember the acronym SAME, S-A-M-E, that tells you sensory afferent, motor efferent, because it's easy to switch up afferent and efferent just like people switch up affect and effect. So this little acronym is very helpful in terms of separating the sensory and the motor divisions into the afferent and efferent neurons respectively. And then the central nervous system, or CNS, is composed of just two principal components, the brain and the spinal cord. So whenever we refer to central nervous system functioning, we're talking about the functioning of the brain and the spinal cord. Now we have interneurons that lie entirely within the central nervous system, and they're between the sensory and the motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system. So interneurons lie entirely within the central nervous system, and they help to link the incoming sensory information with the outgoing motor information. There are two different kinds of interneurons. We have the local interneurons that form circuits with nearby neurons, and they analyze small pieces of information. And then relay interneurons connect circuits of the local interneurons in one brain region with circuits in other brain regions. So they help, these relay interneurons help connect various circuits of these local interneurons so that they can communicate and talk to each other. The spinal cord is a conduit for information to and from the brain. So we have incoming sensory information coming through the spinal cord, and then outgoing information coming from the brain to the spinal cord to execute movements. And the central nervous system is easy to identify because it is entirely encased by bone and it's supported by cerebrospinal fluid, whereas the peripheral nervous system is not. So we'll get much more into detail about the peripheral nervous system and more components of the central nervous system in Chapter 3, probably picking up after the break. So starting with the neuron is the basic unit of our nervous system, and it's specialized to conduct electrical impulses. And it's actually through the flow of ions across the membrane of the neuron that this electrical potential or this electrical energy is generated. The neurons are very sensitive to oxygen deprivation. So they really require a lot of oxygen to function, and any long period of oxygen deprivation is going to have disastrous consequences. Contrary to popular belief, a lot of people think that we're born with a certain number of neurons and that's all we have and they just die off. But actually new neurons are produced after birth and during adulthood. The prototypic motor neuron is listed or indicated up here in this little cartoon, and you can actually see some of the various components of the multipolar neuron, which again is kind of a prototypic motor neuron. We have several components, the main ones involving the soma or body, and that's where a lot of the machinery for to maintain the cell's health lies. We have things like the nucleus, nucleolus, and a variety of other organelles within the soma that are essential for the life of the neuron. Then we have the axon, and it's basically this long, slender tube, and that axon actually carries the action potential or electrical signal that is propagated along the axon. And it usually starts at a place called the axon hillock, which is the beginning of where this myelin sheath is. The myelin sheath simply covers the axon to enhance its ability to conduct the electrical impulse. The dendrites are sort of tree-like structures out here coming off of the soma, and they're actually little antennae, if you will. They receive the incoming information from other neurons. And then finally we have down at the other end of the neuron the terminal buttons. And here, when the action potential reaches the terminal buttons, they start secreting a neurotransmitter to facilitate cellular communication. And most estimates suggest that we have about 100 to 150 billion neurons in the human brain, about 26 to 30 billion in the cerebrum, and 70 billion in the cerebellum. And whenever I see statistics like this, I always wonder who was the poor soul who counted all of those. It's a lot of neurons to count. But amazingly, each neuron may communicate with approximately 10,000 other neurons. And if each neuron in the brain was connected from end to end, our brain would be about 12.5 miles in diameter, which again is just really impressive statistics. And here, this is kind of a, if you go to this link here, you can actually see some of these diagrams. Here we have different kinds of synapses or connections between neurons. This is an actual photomicrograph of, you can see little synaptic vesicles, or these little round circles that contain neurotransmitter. And the fact that we can actually image these things nowadays is really incredible. Now, again, there are several different types of neurons. The motor neurons are typically of the multipolar variety that I showed you on the previous slide, as you see here. The motor neurons, or efferent neurons, transmit impulses to muscles or glands. They stimulate muscular contraction or glandular secretion. And as indicated by the name multipolar neurons, it has many poles or processes coming off of it. The multipolar neurons are found not only in motor neurons but also interneurons. The sensory neurons are of basically two types, a unipolar and a bipolar type. And the sensory or afferent neurons transmit signals from the peripheral tissues like the eye and the ear and the touch organs to the central nervous system. And the bipolar neuron actually has two poles, as indicated by its name, bipolar. There's one axon, one dendrite, and these bipolar neurons are relatively rare. They're found only in the ear and the eye. And the unipolar neurons comprise most of the other sensory neurons in the body. So you can again kind of see the example of the unipolar neuron down here and the bipolar neuron up here. And the bipolar neuron having two poles, basically, the axon and the dendrite over here. And then here's the cell body, or the soma, of the unipolar neuron. And then it has just one process from the cell body, the axon. And it can branch to connect to receptors in the spinal cord or brain. And that little link that I have down at the bottom is, again, very helpful if you wanted to go to that to get more information about the structure of different types of neurons.